Every elegant curve of this English paradise was paid for by the crack of the whip on the sugar plantations of Jamaica. Its columns were bought with money from war trophies, where human lives were simply an expense, and its first stone was laid with a dowry of £20,000 sterling. But that is just money. The reason for its construction is even more terrifying. This house is not a monument to beauty. It is a monument to rage. It was built as an ideological battering ram, aimed directly at the heart of power. Its creator was the most dangerous exile of his era. And here is the main paradox. Today, the state he hated protects this house as a national treasure. You think this is a symbol of tradition? It is a symbol of rebellion. I will show you exactly how he turned a simple garden into the most brazen political insult in the history of British architecture. It all began in 1733, when a public humiliation turned a general into the architect of his own revenge. This is Stowe, the perfect image of England, frozen in the amber of a summer's day. A symphony of Palladian architecture and the English landscape, where every curve of the hill and every column seems created for eternity. Here, on impeccable lawns, students from one of the country's most elite schools play cricket, their white uniforms a bright spot against the ancient greenery. Tourists wander through the gardens, protected by the National Trust, marveling at the harmony created by geniuses of landscape design. It seems these walls breathe tranquility, and the air is steeped in heritage and nobility. But this harmony is a lie, a skillfully crafted illusion. This utopia, this monument to British greatness, was not built by a noble philanthropist or an enlightened patron of the arts. It was created by the proudest, most vengeful, and most dangerous political exile of his era. A man whose name was synonymous with defiance. His name was Richard Temple, Viscount Cobham, and he built Stowe not out of love for beauty, but out of hatred for power. Every portico here is a challenge, every avenue a political treatise, every lake dug by hand is a monument to his unbending will. This house was not meant to soothe. It was meant to declare, to threaten, and ultimately to overthrow. This is not a refuge from the world. It is an alternative court, a center of opposition, an ideological battering ram aimed directly at the heart of London. Look at his portrait. This is not the face of a dreamer. This is the hard, granite-carved face of a soldier, accustomed to discipline and battle. A gaze that doesn't admire the landscape, but assesses a battlefield. There is no room for compromise in those eyes. This is the face of a man who turned his humiliation into stone and forced the entire country to look upon the monument of his rage. And therein lies the great paradox of Stowe. Today, buses bring here those who see in these walls a symbol of order and tradition. The state that Cobham despised now carefully restores every facade. The power he vowed to destroy now guards his legacy as a national treasure. How did this happen? How did a place born of fury, political intrigue, and contempt for the crown become one of the most protected treasures of that very same crown? To understand this, we must see on what money, what blood, and what unbending will its first stone was laid. Before a single stone of Stowe was laid upon another, its financial foundation was established. And if we dig beneath the majestic facade, we find not noble granite, but a layered rock of power, ambition, and human suffering. The money that built Stowe did not appear out of thin air. It was extracted. The first, most ancient layer of this capital smells of wet wool and old earth. In the 16th century, as the Tudor dynasty was breaking old Catholic England over its knee, Viscount Cobham's ancestors, the Temple family, did what all smart opportunists do. They bought up the ruins, ruined monasteries, whose lands had fed monks for centuries, now fed their sheep. Thousands of sheep on the pastures of Buckinghamshire. It seems to us a pastoral scene. But this isn't just wool. This is capital, born from a political coup, the first down payment on building a future dynasty. The next layer was mixed with mud and gunpowder. Viscount Cobham himself was a soldier to the bone. He fought under the command of the great Duke of Marlborough on the bloody fields of Europe. For a general of that era, war was not just a duty, but a business. Every captured city, every victory won, meant not only glory, but also a share of the spoils, lucrative contracts for supplying provisions, and enormous salaries. This stucco, these columns were paid for not only with bravery, but with cold calculation, where human lives were an expense item in the ledger of victory. But the darkest, most profitable stream of gold flowed from a source the aristocracy preferred to ignore. It originated thousands of miles away, under the scorching sun of Jamaica. The Grenville family, into which the Temples had married, owned sugar plantations there. That means they owned people. Every shilling that crossed the Atlantic and flowed into Stowe's budget was squeezed from slave labor. Every elegant curve of a cornice, every perfectly trimmed bush in this English paradise was paid for by the crack of the whip and inhuman suffering. This was the brutal economy of empire, and Stowe is one of its luxurious, silent monuments. Land, war, slavery. All these streams merged into one powerful current, but to begin the great construction, a detonator was needed. A financial explosion. And it came, as it often does, in the form of a marriage contract. Viscount Cobham married Anne Halsey, the daughter of a wealthy London brewer. She brought with her a dowry that was staggering for the time, £20,000 sterling in cash. This was new, fast, city money that poured into old aristocratic capital. But this capital, amassed from wool, steel, and sugar, was not intended for idle luxury or a quiet country life. It was gunpowder. Gunpowder waiting for a single spark of humiliation to explode into the greatest architectural statement in British history. And that spark was not long in coming. In 1733, Viscount Cobham lost a battle. But it was at that very moment he decided to start a war. In London, within the walls of Parliament, his voice was silenced. His career, built on battlefields and in political backrooms, was destroyed with a single stroke of a pen. For daring to vote against Prime Minister Robert Walpole's excise bill, King George II personally stripped him of his command of a prestigious regiment. This was not just a dismissal. It was a public slap in the face, a humiliation designed to break his spirit and turn him into a political corpse. Cast out from the circle of power, Cobham returned to his estate in Buckinghamshire. But this is not the retreat of a broken man into a quiet sanctuary. It is a general regrouping to a pre-prepared position. The road to Stowe is not a road into exile, but to a headquarters. He looks out over his lands, at the hills and valleys, and sees not a pastoral landscape, but a blank canvas for his revenge. He was struck by an idea, brilliant in its audacity. If his voice was no longer heard in Parliament, it would be seen in stone. If his ideas were mocked at court, he would build his own court, one that would outshine the king's. Stowe would cease to be just a house. It would become a statement, a weapon. And like any weapon, it had to be chosen wisely. At the time, Walpole's and the King's Court favored the lavish, theatrical Baroque style, the style of Versailles, the style of absolute monarchies, full of guilt and drama. To Cobham, this was the style of tyranny and corruption. He chose a different language. Palladianism, a style based on the works of the Venetian architect Andrea Palladio, who, in turn, drew inspiration from the temples of ancient Rome, but not the Rome of emperors, the Rome of the Republic. Palladianism is the architecture of logic, harmony, restrained power, and civic virtue. It is the language of senators, not despots. Every symmetrical line, every austere column of his new house was to be a silent rebuke to the chaos and excess of the London court. Stowe is not just a building. It is an ideological battering ram. Its gardens are not a place for strolls, but a political allegory for his guests to read. His library, not a storehouse for books, but an arsenal of ideas. Cobham decided to build an alternative Britain. Here, on his estate, the true heart of the nation would beat, a heart loyal to liberty, honor, and ancient virtues. While there, in the rotten halls of Whitehall, only a corrupt shell would remain. He gathered the best architects. He armed himself with the most powerful ideology. The capital earned on battlefields and in trade deals now went to building ideological battlefields. He was ready to challenge the king and his first minister. But before he could battle men, he first had to do battle with the very land on which he stood. Water is the soul of an English garden. It reflects the sky, creates depth, nourishes the greenery. Its quiet whisper is the soundtrack to an idyll. But here, at Stowe, this soul had one fatal flaw. It didn't exist. The Buckinghamshire landscape, which Viscount Cobham chose for his theatre of revenge, was stubborn and meager. Gentle hills, fertile land, but not a single major river, not a single natural lake. It was a waterless desert, a heart of clay, incapable of reflecting the grandeur of his vision. For anyone else, this would have been a death sentence. For Cobham, it became the first challenge, the first enemy that had to be broken. And so, he started a war. Not with the king, not yet, but with geology. An army came to his lands, an army without muskets or banners, armed only with shovels, pickaxes, and wheelbarrows. Hundreds of laborers, whose names history has not preserved, began a titanic siege of nature. Their task was not simply to dig a pond. They were ordered to create vast multi-acre lakes where the land did not want them. Picture this scene. Day after day, week after week, they tore into the viscous Buckinghamshire clay. This wasn't construction. It was the remaking of creation. Every swing of the shovel was an act of defiance. They did not follow the landscape. They created it. They battled the mud, the groundwater that flooded their trenches. It was a battle where human will was pitted against millions of years of geological history. But digging a gigantic basin was only half the battle. It had to be filled. Cobham's engineers designed a complex system of canals, dams, and pumps. They captured every stream, every runoff, collecting the precious moisture. And then, using horse-powered machinery, they forced water to flow against the laws of physics, to rise upward, only to cascade down into new, man-made channels. The spectacle must have been astounding. Water, compelled to serve the will of one man. Vast lakes that just a year before had been mere fields. A landscape that was no longer a given, but a statement. This was the essence of Cobham. His philosophy was carved not in stone, but in this displaced earth. If the world doesn't give you what you want, you don't ask. You take. You force it to submit. He had conquered the land. He had made the water flow at his whim. Now, on this stage built of clay and will, he was ready to arrange his pieces for the great game. And his first move would be to transform a simple garden into a field of ideological battle. Once the land was conquered and the water tamed, a new general entered the stage. His name was William Kent. He was not a soldier, but he thought like a strategist. He was a painter, an architect, a designer of furniture and gardens, and he shared Cobham's contempt for the suffocating symmetry of French gardens like Versailles, where every bush was trimmed with a ruler, like a soldier on parade. Kent believed that nature abhors a straight line. He was a prophet of the new English style, a style of freedom, naturalness, and hidden meaning. Together with Cobham, they began to transform Stowe from merely a beautiful place into an encrypted message. Their meeting was not just the hiring of an architect, it was an alliance of two conspirators. They walked these hills, looking not at trees, but at possibilities. For them, a garden was not a collection of plants, but a theater of ideas. Every avenue, every turn of the path had to mean something, and they devised a brilliant plan. They would create a route, an allegorical path that would lead the visitor through a labyrinth of moral and political choices. They called it the path of life. This was no mere stroll. It was an ideological maze where every step forced you to think. We can imagine them bent over their blueprints. These were not just planting plans. They were battle maps. Here, on this hill, they decided to erect the temple of ancient virtue, a circular rotunda inspired by ancient Rome. Inside, busts of the great Greeks, Homer, Socrates, Epaminondas. This was their ideal, their banner, a silent declaration. These are the shoulders on which we stand. These are our heroes, thinkers, poets, incorruptible generals. But on a battlefield, one banner means nothing without the enemies. And here, in the creative union of Cobham and Kent, a daring, provocative idea is born. Directly opposite their gleaming temple, across the valley, on another hill, they would place its antipode, its dark reflection. They would call it the Temple of Modern Virtue. The very name was a venomous mockery, a sarcasm cast in stone. Every pavilion they planned became a piece on this vast chessboard. The Temple of British Worthies, their pantheon of national heroes. The grotto, a plunge into dark, primal forces. The pyramid, a symbol of eternity and secret knowledge. This was not a garden. It was a three-dimensional political satire, a philosophical treatise that was not meant to be read, but to be experienced. They were arranging their stone troops, preparing for the main assault. Every column was a soldier, every statue, a sentry. And the most powerful blow, the most insulting attack, was still maturing in their imagination. They were preparing to fire a shot that would be heard across all of England, and this shot would be made of stone. There are hints, there are allegories, and then there is an outright declaration of war. The Temple of Modern Virtue at Stowe was not a hint. It was a punch in the face, the most audacious, most brazen political insult ever built in England. Imagine Viscount Cobham's guests walking through his gardens. They have just left the gleaming temple of ancient virtue, full of images of wisdom and honor. They cross the valley, climb the hill, and see ruins. But these are not ancient, noble ruins, weathered by time. These are new, freshly built ruins. Stones, just hewn by masons, deliberately laid as if the building were about to collapse. The walls are cracked, the roof has caved in. This is not a monument to the past. It is a diagnosis of the present. Cobham and Kent had created not just a building, but a symbol of the moral decay, corruption, and rot that, in their view, had engulfed the government of Sir Robert Walpole. This was not just bad art. It was a brilliant, vicious caricature. They were telling their guests, "Look, here it is, modern virtue. It lies in ruins. It is false to its very foundations. But the most venomous sting awaited inside. In the central niche, where in the ancient temple a statue of a god or a hero would stand, they installed a figure in the robes of a nobleman, with the Order of the Garter on its chest, the highest mark of distinction for the British elite. But this statue had no head. This was unheard of. A headless figure, representing no one in particular, and yet everyone at once. All the ministers, all the corrupt courtiers, and above all, Walpole himself, whom the opposition press constantly depicted in cartoons as a headless colossus. It was a direct, unambiguous accusation. Those in power had no reason, no honor, no face, only an emptiness, covered by expensive robes. Rumors of this structure, of this stone slap in the face, spread across the country like wildfire. They reached London. They reached Whitehall. They reached the ears of the Prime Minister himself. You can imagine his fury. It's one thing to be attacked in pamphlets that are read today and thrown away tomorrow. It is quite another to face an eternal reproach, carved in stone. Cobham was not merely criticizing. He had immortalized his contempt. He had turned the landscape into a durable political pamphlet. This shot hit its mark. The court was furious. The government was insulted. Cobham had shown that he was not just some disgruntled aristocrat who had retreated to the countryside. He was a dangerous enemy, waging a war on his own territory, by his own rules. He had created a weapon that could not be banned or burned. And now, this weapon was ready for the next stage. It would begin to shape the minds of those who would come to replace his enemies. Cobham's stone weapon was loaded. Now he needed marksmen, and he began to gather them. Stowe ceased to be just a construction site. It came alive. In its halls, and more importantly, in its gardens, the most brilliant and dangerous political circle in England began to assemble. These were not aging, resentful aristocrats. This was the youth. Ambitious, eloquent, power-hungry young politicians who saw Robert Walpole as an obstacle in their path. In London, they were mockingly nicknamed Cobham's Cubs or the Patriot Boys. But at Stowe, they were the future of the country. Among them, one figure stood out. Lean, with burning eyes and an aquiline profile. His name was William Pitt. Today we know him as Pitt the Elder, the great Prime Minister, the architect of the British Empire. But back then, he was just a young, impatient member of Parliament, a student in search of a mentor. And he found him in Viscount Cobham. Picture these scenes. The old, battle-hardened general and his young, ardent protégé walk along the avenues of Stowe. Their walk is not idle amusement. It is a lesson. They stop at the temple of ancient virtue, and Cobham speaks of duty to one's country, of the honor of Socrates, of the strategy of Epaminondas. Then they walk to the ruins of the temple of modern virtue, and here the lesson changes. The conversation turns to corruption, to the betrayal of national interests, to the tyranny of one man. Pitt himself would later call the Stowe Gardens the great school of politics. This was no exaggeration. Here, far from the noise of Westminster, the ideology of an entire generation was being formed. These gardens were their textbook. Each temple was a chapter, each monument a paragraph. Cobham didn't lecture them. He made them see, feel, and breathe his ideas. He taught them that politics was not just a struggle for office, but a great moral drama. Stowe became the unofficial parliament of the opposition. In its library, speeches were written that would later thunder in the House of Commons. In its dining rooms, over dinner, strategies were born that would stump Walpole's government. Cobham's Cubs were his living weapon. He invested in them his vision, his anger, his faith in a different Britain. The ideological battering ram he had built of stone and earth began to fire. It fired not with cannonballs, but with men. Men whose minds were honed in this amazing garden, in this three-dimensional book on power and virtue. Viscount Cobham was preparing an army that would one day enter London and seize power. He was sowing seeds, and he did not know that here, right under his feet, unnoticed by all, the seed of a completely different genius was sprouting, one who would change the face of England forever. In the shadow of Viscount Cobham's grand designs and the brilliant insights of William Kent, a figure moved, almost unnoticed by anyone. He was not an aristocrat. He was not an architect. He did not participate in the political debates that thundered in the halls of the estate. He was just a gardener, a young man from Northumberland, hired to look after the trees and lawns. His name was Lancelot Brown. But he had a strange habit. When surveying someone's land, he would often say that it possessed great capability. Very soon, the nickname stuck to him for good. Capability Brown, a genius from nowhere. While Cobham and Kent filled the garden with complex allegories and political symbols, Brown saw something different. He saw not a text to be read, but music to be heard. He learned from Kent, absorbing his revolutionary idea that nature abhors a straight line. But his own genius was already pulling him further. He felt that even Kent's naturalness was too theatrical, too overloaded with meaning. We can imagine him at work. Early in the morning, while the aristocrats are still asleep, he is already in the garden. He is not just mowing the lawn or trimming branches. He is studying. He watches how the light falls on a hill. He observes how the wind sways the treetops. He feels the rhythm of the land. For him, the landscape was not a collection of symbols, but a living organism. He saw its hidden potential, its capability. Stowe became everything to him. It was his school, his university, his laboratory. Here he learned to move thousands of tons of earth to create the perfect curve of a hill. Here he understood how to use trees to create a sense of depth and mystery. Here he mastered the art of water, learning to lay out lakes and rivers as if they had always been there. His style was born right here, on this land, a style that would become the quintessence of the English landscape. The gentle serpentine lines of the lakes, solitary clumps of trees on a perfectly manicured lawn that stretched right up to the walls of the house. No superfluous details, no garish pavilions, just earth, water, sky, and trees, assembled in a perfect, tranquil harmony. Ironically, while Cobham was building his garden as a battlefield, his head gardener was turning it into a sanctuary of peace. Cobham used nature to speak of man. Brown used nature to speak of nature itself. He was the future, a future being born in the shadow of the political intrigues of the past. Cobham's cubs were learning here how to run an empire, and Lancelot Capability Brown was learning how to create paradise on earth. And it was his legacy that would, in the end, prove more enduring. But that triumph was still a long way off, because great ambitions always have a price, and the bill for building paradise had already been issued. Political victory was on the horizon. Walpole's government was faltering under the blows of Cobham's cubs. The ideological weapon of Stowe was hitting its mark. But while the Viscount was winning his war against London, he began to lose another, more insidious war, a war with his own accounts. His ambition had turned into an obsession. He could no longer stop. Every new compliment from an influential guest, every new jab aimed at Walpole, only whetted his appetite. Stowe had to be not just great, but the greatest. Not just impressive, but overwhelming, and this obsession demanded money. Constantly. Every stone in that wall was a share bought on the brink of bankruptcy. Every new statue was a promissory note written against the future. The money from his wife's dowry, from military campaigns, and even from sugar plantations was running out. And Cobham began to do what the aristocracy does as a last resort. He began to sell land. We can imagine the letters that came to him from the managers of his distant estates. Cautious, respectful, but full of alarm. They begged him to slow down. They reported that revenues were falling, that tenants could not pay more. They warned that selling land was like cutting off one's own limbs to feed one's own vanity. But Cobham did not listen to them. To him, these were not expenses. They were investments. Investments in his personal crusade against tyranny. How could a patch of land somewhere in Wales compare in importance to a new temple that the entire political elite of England would see? How could one speak of money when the very soul of the nation was at stake? What began as a noble impulse for justice, as a defense of republican ideals, was slowly transforming into a mania, a gigantomania. He was no longer just building, he was competing with Versailles, with Rome, with history itself, and in this race there was no finish line, and therefore no end to the spending. He did not see, or did not want to see, that beneath the foundation of his ideological paradise, he himself, with his own hands, was planting a financial time bomb. He was certain that his political victory would pay for everything, that his heirs would receive not just an estate, but the center of a new, revitalized Britain. He won his war. In 1742, Robert Walpole, his sworn enemy, was forced to resign. Cobham's cubs came to power. The mission was accomplished. But the bomb kept ticking. The clockwork had been set, and now its destructive force would be passed down from generation to generation, until one day it would shatter into dust everything he had lived for. In 1749, Viscount Cobham died. He died a victor. His enemy was vanquished. His protégés ruled the country. And his manifesto in stone, the Stowe estate, stood as an indestructible monument to his triumph. He left behind a legacy of stone and power, but he could not bequeath his soul. The estate passed to his nephews, the Grenville family. They inherited everything: lands, titles, political influence, and of course, Stowe itself. Ambition, it seemed, was passed down through the bloodline, but its nature had changed beyond recognition. If Cobham built to make a statement, the Grenvilles built to impress. They were interested not in politics, but in status, not in ideology, but in prestige. They looked at Stowe and saw not a weapon, but a stage for demonstrating their wealth and their place at the pinnacle of the social pyramid. The spirit of opposition that had lingered in these gardens began to dissipate. Instead of fiery debates about liberty and tyranny, the halls now echoed with talk of court appointments and advantageous marriages. Instead of using Stowe as a battering ram against power, they began to use it as a magnet to attract that very power. The main project of the new generation was the completion of the south facade, and this project is a perfect symbol of the changing of an era. They added no new allegories. They encoded no new political messages. They simply added scale. A gigantic, staggering, almost imperial scale. The length of the facade reached 290 meters. Dozens of columns, countless windows, endless enfilades of rooms. Stowe ceased to be a manifesto. It was becoming simply the largest and most luxurious palace in the country. This was the architecture of pure vanity. The house no longer demanded anything from its guests except admiration. It no longer asked questions. It merely displayed answers written in the language of money. The scale grew, but the soul of the project vanished. Every new stone added by the Grenvilles made Stowe bigger, but also smaller. It was transforming from a living, breathing organism, full of ideas and anger, into a beautiful but empty shell. The financial time bomb planted by Cobham continued to tick. The new owners, blinded by their thirst for social self-affirmation, not only made no attempt to defuse it, but added fuel to the fire. They spent without a thought for the consequences. They believed their status and their estate were eternal. They did not yet know that a man was about to be born into their own family, who would pull the trigger of this explosive mechanism. A man whose name would become synonymous with the word catastrophe. The history of great dynasties often rhymes. After the generation of creators comes the generation of custodians, and after them, the generation of destroyers. In the story of Stowe, its tragic anti-hero now takes the stage. A man who became the living embodiment of self-destruction. His name was Richard Grenville, the second Duke of Buckingham and Chandos. He inherited everything one could ever dream of. A ducal title, one of the greatest estates in Europe, a name that opened any door. But he inherited neither the iron will of his great-great-uncle Cobham, nor the political acumen of his Grenville ancestors. He was a man without purpose, but with boundless appetites. His only ambition was to maintain a lifestyle that could no longer be financed. He saw the world not as an arena for the battle of ideas, but as a theater where he had to play the leading role, that of the most magnificent aristocrat in England. And this performance required colossal stage sets. He began to spend money he didn't have with an energy worthy of a better cause. His life became an endless pursuit of status. He bought up works of art, maintained a huge staff of servants, and threw lavish receptions. But behind the scenes of this brilliant theater, a financial tragedy was unfolding. The Duke began to borrow. At first, on a large scale, from banks like the Rothschilds, mortgaging distant farms and lands. Then, ever more desperately, from moneylenders at monstrous interest rates. Each new loan was like a dose of a drug, providing temporary relief, but only bringing the inevitable catastrophe closer. He mortgaged everything, paintings, silver, even the family jewels. Bailiffs became regular, though uninvited, guests at his London home. They knocked politely on doors that only yesterday had swung open for ministers and ambassadors. The Duke learned to live under siege, hiding from creditors, making empty promises, and signing more and more promissory notes. He was not a villain. He was a weak man, crushed by the weight of his own legacy. Stowe, which had been a weapon for Cobham, became an unbearable burden for the second Duke, a golden weight around his neck. He could neither maintain it nor give it up. This house demanded he be a titan, but he was merely an actor playing the role of a titan. And in a desperate attempt to save at least the semblance of his greatness, he decided on a final, insane gesture. An act of such extravagance that it would definitively sign the death warrant for his fortune and his honor. He decided to invite the Queen herself to Stowe. In 1845, the second Duke of Buckingham made his final bet. It was the most desperate gamble of his life, an attempt to blind the world with splendor and make everyone forget the rumors, the debts, the bailiffs circling him like vultures. He invited Queen Victoria and Prince Albert to Stowe. This was not just a visit. It was a declaration. The Duke wanted to show all of England that he was still at the top, that his house was still the center of the universe, and for the sake of this performance, he was prepared to burn through the remnants of his fortune. Preparations for the visit turned into a mad, feverish orgy of spending. The Duke behaved not like a host preparing to receive guests, but like a pharaoh building his pyramid. A separate, new road to the estate was laid for the Queen. Her entire path from the main gates to the entrance of the house, several 100 meters long, was carpeted with expensive scarlet cloth. Thousands of pounds were spent on fabric that the royal carriage would travel over just once. The reception itself was the apotheosis of luxury. Hundreds of guests, rivers of champagne, exotic dishes. A special, richly decorated bed was made for the Queen, on which she was to spend only a few nights. The entire house was bathed in the light of thousands of candles, reflected in mirrors and family silver. It was a false, desperate display of wealth that had long since ceased to exist. Perhaps for a few days, the Duke managed to deceive everyone, and most of all, himself. He was once again the center of attention. The newspapers described the magnificence of the reception. The Queen was gracious. It seemed as though the good old days had returned, but it was an illusion, a feast in a time of plague. Every glass of champagne drunk, every oyster eaten, every note played by the orchestra, all of it was paid for on credit. This visit, which went down in history as one of the most expensive private receptions ever given in Britain, became the final nail hammered into the financial coffin of the Grenville family. When the Queen's carriage disappeared beyond the gates, leaving behind the scent of celebration and empty bottles, reality returned with deafening force. Bills that had to be paid, creditors who would wait no longer, and silence. The vast, empty halls of Stowe filled with a deep, ringing silence. The last feast was over, and now it was time for the reckoning. The halls of Stowe remember everything. They remember how the sound of footsteps changed, how the very air within them changed. To understand the depth of the fall, one must compare two eras, two worlds that existed within the same walls. First, the era of Viscount Cobham. The house then was a hive, buzzing with ideas. In its library, smelling of the leather of old bindings, it wasn't polite conversation that took place, but intellectual duels. Here, in the shadow of thousands of books, political strategies were born. A young William Pitt honed his eloquence, debating with poets and philosophers. The guests were not just aristocrats, but future prime ministers, architects of laws, creators of an empire. The air was electrified with ambition, but it was the ambition to change the world. Every corner of the house was part of a grand design, every room a study or a council chamber in this great war of ideas. Now, let us move forward 100 years, to the era of the second Duke. The walls are the same, but the air is different. It had become rarefied, cold, empty. 400 rooms, designed to accommodate an entire court, now stood silent and dusty. The house came alive only occasionally, during desperate, extravagant balls, when hundreds of candles for one night concealed the desolation, and loud music drowned out the silence. But when the guests departed, the house would sink back into a lethargic slumber. It had become a golden cage for its final master. The Duke wandered these endless enfilades alone. His wife, humiliated by his debts and infidelities, had long since left him. His only companions were the ghosts of past glory and servants to whom he hadn't paid wages in months. One can imagine him, sitting in the enormous dining room at a table set for 50, completely alone, or standing at a window, looking out at the gardens that for his ancestor had been a battlefield, but for him had become only a reminder of his debts. The house that was built as a statement of strength had now become a monument to his powerlessness. He no longer controlled the estate. The estate controlled him. It demanded coal for hearths he could not light. It demanded repairs for roofs he could not mend. It demanded a life he could not breathe into it. These walls had seen the birth of a political dynasty and its agony. They had heard speeches about freedom and false promises to creditors. They hold the memory of two lives, one full of meaning and struggle, and the other empty, wasted on maintaining illusions. And soon they were to witness the final, most humiliating act of this drama. In 1848, a disaster that had been brewing for decades finally erupted. The Duke, pursued by a horde of creditors whose total debt reached £1.5 million, committed a final act of cowardice. In the dead of night, he fled the country, leaving his home, his name, and his legacy to be torn apart. And then, the bailiffs entered Stowe, not as guests, but as masters. The doors that once opened for kings were now thrown open for appraisers and auctioneers. The most grandiose and most humiliating bankruptcy in the history of the British aristocracy had begun. For several months, they walked the empty halls, compiling an inventory. Every item, from Rembrandt paintings to chamber pots, was numbered, valued, and catalogued. This was not just an inventory. It was a public autopsy, an anatomical theater where the corpse of a great dynasty was put on display for all to see. And then, the great Stowe sale began. It lasted for 40 days. 40 days of national shame. News of the event spread across the country, and crowds flooded into Buckinghamshire. It was more than a sale. It was a spectacle. The railway companies, sensing a profit, ran special auction trains, bringing in thousands of onlookers who came to gawk at the fall of a giant. We see it through the eyes of the reporters of the time. The halls where the fate of the empire was once decided were now packed with merchants, dealers, and the merely curious. The auctioneer, standing on a makeshift rostrum, cried out the lots. The famous Chandos portrait of Shakespeare, a national treasure, was sold for a mere 355 guineas. Thousands of ounces of family silver were sold by weight, simply as metal to be melted down. Books from the great library, collected over generations, were sold off in bundles. The humiliation was not confined to the walls of the house. It spilled out into the park. The deer that had grazed on these lawns for centuries were mercilessly shot and sold as carcasses to local butchers. Trees that remembered Cobham himself went under the axe. This was not just the bankruptcy of one man. All of England felt that it was the end of an era. The auctioneer's gavel, striking again and again, beat out a funeral march for the old aristocracy. It signaled that an ancient name and glorious ancestors could no longer save one from debt, that a new era, an era of capital and commerce, had come to claim its due. When the last lot was sold, and the last wagon, laden with another's heritage, left the estate, a dead silence fell over Stowe. The house was gutted. Its soul had been sold off, piece by piece. It seemed this was the end. A vast, empty tomb, doomed to oblivion and decay. After the great sale, Stowe fell silent. For decades, the gutted giant stood empty and abandoned, a ghost of its former self. Wind roamed its cold halls, peeling away the last of the gilding. Rain seeped through the roof, leaving dark stains on the walls where masterpieces once hung. The gardens, created by geniuses, became overgrown with weeds, and the temples and pavilions slowly crumbled, turning into real, not symbolic, ruins. It seemed this was the end. In 1921, the house was put up for sale. The main buyer was a company that saw no history or beauty here. They saw only building materials, thousands of tons of stone, lead, and timber that could be sold off for a profit. The auctioneer's hammer was already raised to break Stowe into pieces. But then, something unforeseen happened. A miracle. In 1923, the first students of a new boarding school entered these abandoned, echoing halls. Stowe School. Dozens of boys in school uniforms filled the dead house with life, laughter, and noise. Their voices banished the ghosts of the past. The building survived. But it survived not because of its creators, but in spite of them. It was saved not by the aristocracy, but by a new era. It was saved by a new, completely unexpected purpose, one that Viscount Cobham could not have imagined in his wildest dreams. And here we have it, the final paradox of this story. Look, a schoolboy sits with a book in the temple of ancient virtue, the very same temple that Cobham built as a political manifesto, as a rebuke to his enemies. Now, it is not a stage for angry speeches, but a quiet place to study. The ambitions of its creators have turned to dust. Their fortune is gone. Their dynasty has ended. Their political battles are long forgotten. But the stone remains. And this stone tells us not only of their vanity and their struggle. It speaks of the strange, almost mystical ability of great creations to outlive their creators, to shed their intentions like old skin, and to find a new, completely unexpected life, to find a soul of its own. Thus ends this saga of stone and human passion. It teaches us that great creations, born of anger or vanity, ultimately prove stronger than their creators' designs, forging their own unpredictable destiny. And if even a stone, saturated with one man's fury, can in time become a cradle for thousands of new destinies, then what are we truly building? A monument to our anger, or a stage for a future we cannot foresee? This story is just the beginning of a conversation. Share your thoughts in the comments, because it is in the clash of ideas, as we have seen, that something truly great is born. And if our story has made you think, your like and subscription will be the best sign that we are on the right path.